For the next 7 days, I am going to work entirely from an iPad. Everything I do, work, editing, design, file management, has to happen on this. This is Apple's new M4 iPad Air, and on paper, it's powerful enough to replace a MacBook, but after using it for a week, I didn't expect this. Some things felt incredible on the iPad and others completely broke my workflow. If you're someone like a student or working full-time and you're, sick of carrying a big laptop everywhere, let's see if this M4 iPad Air can do it all instead. But first, we need to unbox it. So out of the box, it looks exactly the same as it did 4 years ago, but hey, it's still a great design, paper thin and lightweight, plus the 13-inch variant here gives me a lot of screen estate to work with. I also bought the new updated Magic Keyboard to go with it, a must if you're going to be maining this iPad, but that's until I realized I was an absolute idiot and bought the wrong 11-inch size. So yeah, I guess the trip back to the Apple store I go. Alright guys, we finally got the bag. Took way longer than I thought. It's really busy because of the Neo release, but yeah, we've got the bag now. Let's get going with the setup of the iPad. So finally back at home after the detour, I got back to setting it up. I'm setting this up as a fresh iPad, so once I was through with the initial setup, I began installing all the apps I rely on every day. And this is the overall home screen and lock screen setup that I've settled on with all the essential apps I'll be using for the week. I think it looks pretty decent if you ask me, and now let's put it through its paces in the week ahead. On the first day with it, I was out most of the day working on the iPad in between tennis, meeting with friends and running errands, so I was loving the portability that day, but what actually surprised me was iPadOS 26. At first, I genuinely wanted to quit and go back to my MacBook with Finder, a desktop, and all my folders, but after a few hours, something just clicked. Once I got used to all the gestures and shortcuts, multitasking actually became kind of second nature. I found myself using Stage Manager and Split Screen View a lot, and just generally swiping between windows quickly and easily. And this is where the iPad still wins, that touchscreen. It just feels more natural, and honestly, this is the closest thing we have to a touchscreen MacBook right now, but there's definitely a learning curve to getting used to iPadOS, and I'd be lying if I said it's perfect. For example, in split view, parts of the UI can get cut off, like certain buttons or menus just aren't accessible unless you full screen the app, which is pretty inconvenient when you're mid-task. But hang on, what if I hook it up to a studio display monitor in a dedicated desk setup? Maybe this is where I can properly push the M4 chip. And this is where I thought the iPad would either prove itself or completely fall apart with my workflow. So first, I ran a couple of benchmark tests just to get an idea of its performance, and as expected, the numbers are seriously impressive for something this thin. We're talking performance that's now very close to what you'd expect from many modern mid to high-end laptops. The jump in memory on the M4 iPad Air up to 12GB from 8GB also helps drastically. So clearly, the real challenge here isn't raw performance, it's actually whether iPadOS and the apps can actually keep up with the hardware. And that's kind of where things started to get interesting. So I got to using Final Cut Pro, which, by the way, I was disappointed to find out that it is actually a subscription app, because apparently buying it once wasn't enough. But hey, what's one more subscription at this point, right? To the M4 iPad Air's credit, scrubbing through 4K footage was smooth, cutting clips, adding transitions, basic color adjustments, all felt fast and responsive. So for quick edits, social content, rough cuts, even YouTube timelines, this is way more capable than I expected. The export times on the 4K files were also MacBook level fast. On average, the same 10-minute 4K video took roughly 8 minutes to export, whereas the M4 MacBook Air was a couple of minutes faster, likely because the MacBook has larger thermal headroom, whereas the iPad is, well, a tablet. And here's what I quickly realized. The problem, again, isn't the hardware, it is iPadOS. Sure, I can get simple edits done, but I had to postpone my bigger, more complicated edits this week because many plugins aren't supported and tools like object tracking are missing. So as much as I actually love how minimal the whole studio display with the iPad setup is, the software just doesn't let the whole setup shine. And it's sort of like putting a sports car in peak hour traffic. Technically, it's doing everything you ask of it, but it's built for something way more fluid, way more flexible out on the open roads. And that's exactly how I felt about the iPad Air in this setup. But iPad Airs aren't meant to be docked, they're meant to be used on the go, which leads me to what I loved about the iPad Air. Firstly, and most obviously, its versatility and form factor. Because it's so thin, I found myself using it in more places than I ever would with a MacBook. From a library, to the cafes, to park benches, or even under a tree in a beautiful sunny day. Then, as soon as I needed to lock in and get work done, I'll just snap on the keyboard and it essentially becomes a laptop. And I might be strange, but personally, I find the iPad keyboard so satisfying to use. Maybe even more so than the MacBook's Magic Keyboard. Something about it being so flat, close to the table surface, and its low key travel distance all feels very satisfying to type on. Another win is the N1 wireless chip, along with the C1X modem for cellular models. This basically means faster Wi-Fi, better connectivity, and more stable performance when you're working remotely or, uploading files on the go. So it's all optimized for the portable, go wherever type experience. On the iPad, you've got access to apps that just don't exist on Mac in the same way. Things like Netflix, Disney Plus, even YouTube, where you can download content offline and just take it with you. And paired with the touchscreen, it makes the whole experience feel way more natural and flexible, especially when you're just relaxing or, kicking back and consuming some content. But at the same time, this is where the trade-offs start to show, because if you compare this to something like a MacBook Air or even something like the $600 Neo, you've already got the keyboard built in. It's way more comfortable to type on in bed or for longer sessions, and you're getting the full Mac OS experience with the full proper apps and programs that just don't exist on the iPad. So that brings me on to what I didn't like about the iPad Air over the week. It's not one big problem, it's death by 1,000 small inconveniences. And first off is, again, iPadOS itself. As much as I appreciate its simplicity, it just doesn't take advantage of the M4 chip's power like I mentioned earlier. Most of the apps like Final Cut Pro or Adobe Photoshop, Illustrator, and even Microsoft Excel are missing advanced formulas, plugins, certain features. So if you're used to doing work on a Mac like I am, you'll notice the watered down app versions. And so that leads me onto the hardware side of things outside of the M4 chip, because it's not bad, but it also hasn't really moved forward in the ways that matter and has basically remained the same. So for example, the cameras, they have been the same for years. The display is also still 60 Hz, and that 600 nits peak brightness really struggles outdoors. None of these are deal breakers on their own, but over the course of a full week, they stack up. And that's when I kept having this thought. Dang, this would be so much easier on a MacBook. I constantly had that thought throughout the week. And I think that's the core issue with the iPad right now. Whether it's an iPad Pro or iPad Air, they're both incredibly powerful, convenient, and portable, but you're constantly working around it because of iPadOS. We've also got to talk about battery life on the new M4 iPad Air. On paper, Apple still claims around 10 hours of usage, which sounds solid, and in lighter mixed use, like watching videos, browsing, emails, it does get pretty close to that. But in my experience, using all sorts of apps at 80 to 90% screen brightness, I was getting closer to like 6 to 8 hours of real world use, which isn't bad, but it's also not particularly impressive anymore. So this iPad now has M4 level performance, but the battery life hasn't really moved forward at all. If anything, it feels very similar or even slightly behind previous generations. So what you end up with is a really powerful device that doesn't necessarily last longer than before. It'll still get you through most of a day, but if you're planning to actually push this thing the way the M4 chip suggests you can, you're probably going to be reaching for the charger more than you expect, like I did throughout the week. Truthfully, it's just not able to replace my MacBook, but it did change how I think about where and how I work, because what the iPad does really well is simplicity, I think. iPadOS forces you into a more focused, intentional workflow. You're not just juggling 10 windows, you're just doing one thing properly. And whether or not it works for you depends on how much you work, what type of work you do, and how much you're willing to adapt as well. So an iPad changes the experience. It feels less like a work machine and more like something that fits into your life on a plane, at a cafe, on the couch, in the park. It's a device you want to pick up and interact with, but unfortunately, that same simplicity is also its limitation, because every moment my work gets even slightly complex this week, I felt it. And that's when I kept having the same thought all week. This would have been easier on my MacBook Air, or even honestly the MacBook Neo. So instead of replacing my Mac, the iPad became a companion. It's where I plan and write and sketch ideas, and then move to a proper machine to finish the job. And then there's the pricing too, because here's the biggest dilemma. Once you kit it out with the keyboard and Apple Pencil, more storage, you're looking at a price tag higher than the new M5 MacBook Air, which already comes with 512GB storage out of the box. Heck, you could get more workflow flexibility on the $600 MacBook Neo and sacrifice little. So don't get me wrong, I love the iPad Air, but I just wish that Apple would evolve iPadOS into something closer to like Mac OS Lite, because the hardware is already there. We all know that. The M4, the performance, the design, it's more than capable. It's just being held back by the software. Think something like Microsoft Surface Pro, which runs Windows 11. That's an incredible device, and I was able to get my full workflow done on that tablet. But if you value portability, flexibility, and a more lifestyle-driven experience, the iPad Air might actually be the better choice. And that's why this decision I think is so personal, because for some people, the iPad is freeing and for others is limiting. So maybe the real answer isn't iPad or MacBook, it's iPad and MacBook. But hey, I'm curious, could you actually replace your laptop with an iPad Air or not? And for the iPad owners out there, where does it sit in your life and how do you use it? If you enjoyed this review, drop a like and subscribe for more. You want to catch my review on the Microsoft Surface here too. It's an incredible device that runs Windows 11 instead. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.